me. You see, if you have your Bibles, you can open up to Hebrews chapter 11. That's where we're at today. As I was working through the sermon, planning this, I began to realize that really what chapter 11 is highlighting for us is this cloud of witnesses that surround us. And it began to cause me to think about the legacy that is in my life from the cloud of witnesses that have been in my life. And I began to think of my elementary school teachers, Miss Cox and Miss Coffey and Miss Flowers, who invested in me and challenged me as a young boy. And I began to think of my high school teachers, Mr. Harlan, and my coaches, Mr. Underwood and Mr. Hall, and those men who invested in me in high school. And began to think of my pastor, Brother Darrell Hayes, Brother Don Wilhite, who just spoke and worked in my heart and my life over the years. I began to just think of the coworkers that I had while I was here at the school, and just the many people over my life that just kind of poured into me and just invested in me. Some of them, have left sort of statements, phrases, ideas in my brain, in my heart, in my soul. I kind of live by today. I'm like, dream big dreams, think big thoughts. Thanks to Dr. Bill Brown in college. Just things that sort of help guide your way of life. And as we look at Hebrews chapter 11, which is what we've been looking at over the last several weeks, that legacy is there. We are surrounded by such a cloud of witness. I imagine that you have a similar reality. You can think back over various parts of your life and you can see people who came in and influenced you, kind of shaped your life, changed your direction, altered the course of your path. And those are living legacies. Those are realities of ours that we need to be thoughtful of and think about and contemplate and just kind of be prayerful and praise God for. This morning I'm preaching using my dad's Bible. This was my dad's Bible when I was a young fella. I don't even know if Ricky has seen this but a couple years ago, I was at the house and I said, Dad, I want your Bible. This is the one that he had when I was like 10, 11, 12 or so, somewhere in there. And as I've flipped through this and I've seen things that he's highlighted and notes that he's made in this Bible, I remember conversations that we've had. I was like, well, I remember that. I mean, there's the note, right? I mean, I can remember. And so this Bible reflects a legacy that I have, that my brother has, that my son and my nieces have, because of the legacy of my mom and my dad. There's tears on these pages. There's thoughts on these pages. There's circles. There's question marks on these pages. There's underlines. There's notes. There's old pieces of when he preached a funeral still stuck in the pages. And it just I remember the stories of my father teaching me. There's a legacy there. You have one. I have one. Yours is different than mine. But the results, hopefully, are the same. The legacy that you have, the legacy that I have, points me to who Jesus is. And it's because of my father, my mother, those other men and women that were part of my life that have shaped me, that have molded me, that have instilled in me a love for the King. And today, as we look at our text in Hebrews chapter 11, we're going to be looking at the prophet Moses. Now, Moses was, for the people of Israel, he was like the prophet. Like, as a matter of fact, at the end of Deuteronomy, after Moses is dead and he's been buried and no one knows where he's been buried, the scribes kind of put this little notation at the end of we're still hoping that one day another prophet like Moses will show up. Man, we'd love to have another one like Moses. Right? Moses was the prophet. And so today we're going to look at the life of Moses. And in chapter 11, Moses kind of gets a little bit more attention than some of the other faith leaders that we're familiar with. And what's interesting is because there's a lot of weight to Moses. I'm going to pull up my glasses because although I love this Bible, this is one of those Bibles for people with good eyes. This is not the kind of Bible with people who have bad eyes. Mine's got big old letters in it. This has got like that subscript, kind of super small. So we're going to put on the glasses. So Hebrews 11, we're going to look at each of these sort of verses. We're going to start verse 23. And here's what he says. Hebrews 11, verse 23 is, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw that he was a proper child, a beautiful child. And they were not afraid of the king's commands. Now, this is the old King James English. I'll be reading out of the ESV going forward so that we don't get too confused. But I just wanted to highlight that Moses was a man who had a family of faith. A family of faith. If you go back to the story in Exodus chapter 2, end of chapter 1 and chapter 2, where we kind of get to see this story unfold, what you're going to see is that the king who grew up did not know Joseph. And now this new Pharaoh was a little concerned about all these Hebrews that were populating and growing and prospering in his land, and he saw them as a threat. And so he commanded that all the male children be killed. Well, that didn't seem to do the job. And so he made another edict and basically said, as soon as a child is born, right, so the maids that are kind of helping with this, as soon as a child is born, if it is a boy child, you are to kill it on the spot. So this is a pretty bad time period to be having children. In the Hebrew life. Moses' family, however, demonstrated that they had faith in God. Instead of Moses being killed, Moses was hidden. And his mom hid this baby for 3 months. And then it got to the point that they couldn't just hide in the house anymore. And so she makes this little ark. And she puts this baby in the ark and sort of keeps him out at the river in the reeds so they can keep him safe. Their fearlessness in the face of the edicts of the king foreshadowed the fearlessness that their son would have. Their faith over fear foreshadows the kind of life that Moses is going to live, in which he demonstrates a life of faith over fear. And it's illustrating that how living a life of faith, trusting and placing our life and our faith in the hand of God, can set people free from the fear of death, the fear of life, the fear of the unknown, the fear of whatever. By understanding and having a perspective of who God is, it gives us the ability to live a life of faith. Both Jewish and Christian cultures have had a strong tradition of preferring reverence of God or the fear of God or the reverence of God's commands over the commands of humans. There's been lots of evidence throughout the history of both Jew and Christians who stand up defiantly against the injustice of our world, against the laws and the commands of the world, of humans, against the laws and the command of God. God says do A, and it doesn't matter if other people say don't do it. We're going to follow the laws of God. We're going to follow the commands of God. We're going to operate in that paradigm. And when we put God first, it changes the way we see the world. And putting God first is not just a mantra. It's not just a saying. It's not just a thing that we communicate with words. It is only demonstrated by our actions. You can say, James, if you want to study the book of James, this is the essence of James. You can say that you have faith in God. James simply says, show me your works. Because faith without action is worthless. Putting our faith in God is more than just a mantra. It's more than just a mindset. It's more than just an idea. It's demonstrated by how we live. It's demonstrated in what we do. It's demonstrated in our priorities. It's demonstrated in what we put preference to over others. If we choose faith over fear, it causes us to act a particular way. Now, in the first verse, the faith over fear, we see a family of faith. We see mom and dad being willing to exercise faith in the midst of death. Now, as far as I'm aware, if I'm wrong, please let me know at the end of the service. There may be some of you online that are in this situation, depending on where you're at and what part of the world you're in. But as far as I know, none of us are facing death as a consequence of living out our faith. Right? I don't think there's anybody that way. If there is, I'd love to hear your story. Our problems rely on we may lose a job, or we may be criticized, or some of these simple things that kind of hurt our feelings. Families of faith put priority of God over everything else. God's commands. Hey Dad, what if you prioritized, I don't want to step on toes, so put your boots on. I'm going to put mine on too. Hold on. Dad, what if you prioritized your family faith over your job? What if you prioritized the faith of your children over your 401k? What if, Mom, you prioritized your children and your family's life over your career? I don't know what it may be. Hey, what if we prioritized our family over the extracurricular activities of our children? What if we decided to cut some hours back? Instead of working 60, we work 50. Instead of having to do 3 jobs, we just do 2 jobs. Instead of driving our kids all over town to do all these different things, we begin to prioritize some stuff. We reshape and realign the priorities so that they are aligned with a dependence on God rather than a dependence on me. I can do this. What if we reshape our priorities? What if we do? Would we then be willing to accept the risk associated with it? Maybe you don't have quite as much in your 401k and you have to work till you're 75 or 80 before you can retire. Maybe you don't have enough money to buy the extra thing or buy the new car. You have to buy a used car. Maybe you don't have enough to buy 2 cars. You only have 1. Maybe, I don't know what it may be in your life. Maybe your kid can't play the travel team ball or the whatever ball 1 year. I don't know. Whatever. If we begin to prioritize living a life of faith and developing a life of faith in our families, what might we have to sacrifice to do that? And the question is, are we willing to do it? Dad, Mom, grandparent, your faith lived out is going to shape the faith of your children and your grandchildren. They are going to model your faith. They're going to model it. When you run into crisis and they see you praying to find a solution, you're going to find them, when they run into crisis in their life, going to prayer to find a solution. If, however, you run to something else, they're going to run to something else. They're going to model that behavior. They're going to model that lifestyle. The people that you place in front of your children, make sure that you put them in front of people of faith, because they're going to model that behavior. The family living a life of faith over fear leads to an identity of faith. That's our second point for the day, an identity of faith. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 24 to 26 says this: by faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Now there's a lot here. Like you could just unpack this and spend a whole lot of time unpacking what the preacher is saying in this verse. Moses at this point was in his late 30s, close to 40 years old, when all of a sudden he refuses to be called Pharaoh's daughter anymore. He is aware of who he is. He recognizes and understands his Hebrew heritage, his ethnicity, his cultural background, and he now refuses to be called Pharaoh's daughter. He makes a conscious decision to change his course of life. He was educated, he was trained, he was equipped to be a prince of Egypt. And he evaluated, do I want to be a prince of Egypt? Or do I want to be hated like the Hebrews? Do I want to be identified as the prince and king of Egypt? All of the prosperity and wealth that comes along with it. Or do I want to be identified with the slaves? Moses chose to be identified with the slaves. He willingly gave up the plush, opulent lifestyle of a prince in order to become a slave of Egypt. This willful act, this intentional decision, this willingness to leave the opulence of life to identify with these Hebrew slaves is rooted in a faith that is committed to do what is right rather than what is preferred. He was committed to do what was right rather than what was preferred. It would have been easier, a whole lot easier, just to sort of, well, maybe I can make a difference as a prince in Egypt. Hey, that makes sense. I can make a difference. If I stay and I become the Pharaoh, then look what all the good I can do. He chose to do what was right rather than what was preferred. Faith made him to prefer the adoption of the King of Kings rather than the king of the Egyptians. It was a flesh and blood decision, and it was a life and death decision, and it was a big consequence decision. But his identity was tied to his faith. He chose rather to suffer affliction alongside the Hebrew slaves with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a period of time. Moses made the decision. He said, I am not going to be identified with this any longer. I know who I am. I come from a family of faith. I have a legacy of faith, and I'm going to sit in that reality. And I'm going to honor the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. I'm going to identify with Christ. Now, I thought that was interesting. I read through this. I'm like, Hebrew, man, the writer of Hebrews, he's sort of putting Christ in the Old Testament here, right? When you read Exodus chapter 2 and you read the story, like, I don't see Jesus Christ listed anywhere there. But what the writer of Hebrews is trying to help us understand is that when we are suffering in the righteousness of God, we are taking on the same suffering that Christ took on. And although Moses was not aware of Jesus Christ, and that was not part, what the writer of Hebrews is helping us understand is by making this decision and being a man of faith and making the decision to identify with the people of God and the way of God, that he was taking upon himself the suffering of Christ. The pleasure of the Egyptian court is qualified in two specific type of words. It is qualified as something that is temporary, as opposed to something that we abide in. I don't know if you remember, we're called in the New Testament that he is the vine, I am the branches, right? And if we are to abide in him, this is a call for us. And this is the same kind of word. And this word frequently is used in this exhortation in the text, to abide, to abide, to abide. Christ's reproach and suffering that comes about by identifying with Christ and with God's people. The suffering that results from that is honorable. Paul would use words like, I'm thankful for my suffering. You know, he kind of helps us understand that to suffer in the stripes in the same way that Christ suffered is a reward. Christ's reproach is wealth that sin's pleasures and society cannot rival. A massive 401k does not compare to the suffering that comes along with being a believer and follower of Christ. Christ's reproach is honorable, and it is healthy, and it is good, and it is rewarding, our perspective has to change. Moses' choice is motivated by his evaluation of the worth of the treasures of Egypt compared to the reproach, as the writer of Hebrews says, the reproach of Christ. And he made his decision. I will abandon the wealth of Egypt for the reproach of Christ. And he found that that was a greater treasure. How do we evaluate the offerings of this world? Think about it. How do you measure and where do you put the weight? Do we see them as worthy of our work and our identity? Do we identify by the things that we do? Or do we live in faith and partake in the suffering of Christ to receive an eternal identity? If we will forsake the rewards of this world in exchange for the suffering of Christ, we will experience an enduring faith. An enduring faith. This is the third point for the day. Enduring faith. Look at verse 27. Chapter 11, verse 27. It says, by faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Now, verse 23 and verse 27 have a parallel element to them. His mom and dad were not afraid of the king because they had faith. And their life primed and prepared Moses to be able to mirror that reality. Moses was not afraid of the king because of faith. The tension in this verse, when compared to Exodus chapter 2, verse 14, which is where Moses says he was afraid and he fled Egypt, doesn't say that he was afraid of Pharaoh. He was afraid that he was caught. Right? If you go back to look at Exodus chapter 2, the story is Moses sees a Egyptian soldier whipping and mistreating a Hebrew, and so he stops him, and in doing so he kills him and he buries him in the sand, and he comes back the next day and he encounters a couple of Hebrews fighting with one another. He's like, hey brothers, what are you doing? Why are you fighting? And they're like, oh, what are you going to do? You going to do to one of us like you did to that Egyptian yesterday? And they're like, and Moses is like, they know. And he leaves, right? There's some tension there. Is he operating out of fear, or is he operating out of faith? Every month, the pastors have the opportunity to go to the gardens, and we get the opportunity to have coffee and pastries with some of the men of the gardens. It's just a men's fellowship, and we get to go down there and hang out and drink a cup of coffee or two and have some conversations. And most of the guys that come to that are former pastors. They've pastored churches or whatever. They've been believers for a long time. And so it's fun to listen to their stories. It's fun to ask them questions. And so as we were down there, I had the opportunity to go down last week. And we were talking. I was telling Brother John, morning Brother John, they're at the gardens watching the service today. I asked Brother John, I said, John, here's what I'm preaching about. And there's this tension to me that exists between this idea of fear and faith. And I just listened to him talk. And Brother John kind of helped me get this reality in my own, I was like, that's exactly what I'm trying to say. He goes, there's a paradox. Fear and faith are kind of a paradox. They appear to be contradictory to one another. Like you cannot have faith and be afraid, and you cannot be afraid and have faith. And it's a paradox because they kind of can work together in an interesting sort of way. Let me give you an example, because probably most of us have lived this example. When I was a youngster, my aunt had put a pool in, and so we would go over to their house regularly during the summer, and we would go swimming. And I was pretty good at swimming. I was, in the shallow end, when I could stand up on my feet, man, I was a go-getter. I could swim across that pool and underwater and all this kind of stuff. And I'd finally got to that age, whatever that age is, I don't know, when somebody says, you need to be able to swim in the deep end. You can do this. Why don't you jump off the diving board? I was like, no, thank you. I'm not diving off the diving board. And then my cousins would be out there jumping off the diving board. It would look very enticing, but it also looked very scared. And I was like, I'm not doing that. And finally, my dad would be out there swimming. He goes, come on, jump off the diving board. And I don't want to. I'm afraid. You finally get out to the edge of the diving board. You know, you've been there, right? You get to walk out to the edge of the diving board and you look over and it just looks like it's a 60-foot drop. You know, it's only just a few feet, but it just looks forever. You're like, whoo, and you walk back off the diving board and your cousins are like, come on, you can do it. It's awesome. And finally, when your dad kind of gets right out, like he can touch the edge of the dive, he can touch your toes as they're hanging over the edge, you know. So dad is out there now. He's in the water. He's touching, like he's right. He's like, come on, I'll catch you. And I'm looking over. My heart, you've been there, right? Your heart's beating out of your chest. You're like, I'm going to die. Like, that's the thought that's running through your 8, 9, 10-year-old brain. Like, I'm about to die. This is going to kill me. I can't do this. And your dad is like, come on, I'll catch you. I'll get you. And finally, you kind of do this fall. It's not a dive. It's not even a jump. You just kind of just lean over and you kind of keep leaning until you can't lean. You know what I mean? You've been there. And so, and then dad catches you and he kind of carries you to the edge of the pool and you're like, hey, that wasn't so bad. Right? You've been there, right? We've all done this, right? Here's the reality. There's a paradox. Faith and fear are living together in that moment. I am scared to death. I literally, as an 7, 8, 9-year-old kid leaning over the edge of that pool, watching that happen, I'm like, if my dad was not there, I was not going in. I don't care if my cousins were there. I don't care if I was not doing that. But my dad was there. And I trusted my dad enough to know he wouldn't do something that would cause me to get killed. Now, he may do something that make me hurt. I may walk away injured. That's happened before. But he's not going to do anything that's going to make me die. And so that level of fear went away, and I jumped. This is a paradox. How can we have fear in a moment and then still operate in faith? The reason is because we have a faith in the object. There's an object of our faith that is greater than the fear that we're dealing with. Fear is a powerful, motivating hindrance to our life. But when we have a greater understanding of the God that we serve, this faith paradox can be resolved. The two seemingly contradictory experiences, they can cohabit in our life at the same time. The question is, who is the object of our faith? If the object of our faith is ourself, fear will always win. If the object of our faith is God, faith can win. My ability to overcome my fear is the object of my faith. It is the object of the thing that I trust in. And it was the object of my Father, not me. When I tried to do it, I backed off the diving board. When my cousins were down there, I backed off the diving board. I was still afraid when I jumped. I thought I was going to die, but my dad was going to catch me. We can overcome fear, not because we've overcome fear, but because we have placed a greater trust in the object of our faith. Moses' enduring faith is connected to him having seen the invisible. He knew the object of his faith. He encountered the personal God in the burning bush. He talked with God. He encountered the power of God through the turning of his staff into a serpent and then picking that staff back up and it's now a staff. Or taking his hand and putting his cloak and it comes out leopard and it puts it back in and it comes back clean. He had encountered the invisible God. And now when Moses goes back to Egypt to say, let my people go, he can stand before Pharaoh, not afraid of Pharaoh. You do whatever you want to. As a matter of fact, near the end, and after the 9th plague, the Pharaoh looks at Moses and says, the next time I see your face, I'm going to kill you. And Moses goes, okay, I'll see you tomorrow. Like, he has lost the sense of fear of the king because he has identified and understands the power of God. When we see God in the invisible, when we understand who he is and what he has done, when we encounter the crucified Christ, the sight of God will enable believers to endure the end, endure the fear, overcome the anxiety, whatever that comes in our way, because we understand the God. It is this endurance, this second wind faith that allows us to live a life of faith. Our fourth point of the day is to live the life of faith. Live a life of faith. Verse 28 says this, by faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. In Exodus chapter 12, verses 21 and 30, we see this story of the Passover. This is an odd story. Like just place yourself in the midst of this story for a moment. I'm going to come up to you as Moses. I'm going to say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We've seen 9 plagues, and they've been really bad. Now, this 10th plague is going to affect you too if you don't do the following. All right, this is how you protect yourself from the 10th plague, and it's going to it's going to kill the firstborn of every child in the country. And here's what you do. I want you to go out and get a lamb, a perfect lamb, a lamb that has no blemish on it. I want you to sacrifice that lamb. I want you to take some of that blood, and I want you to take some grass, some stems over here. I want you to take that, dip it in that little bowl of blood, and then I want you to dab it on the top of the doorpost, on the side of the doorpost, right? So that there's blood on the doorpost. And then I want you to take that lamb, I want you to go through, be like, I have a question. How is that supposed to do something? Like, I don't understand. Like, this does not, how is that going to protect me? Like, this doesn't make sense. You mean a couple drops of blood on the outside of my door is supposed to protect me somehow? This feels like hocus pocus, like, crystal or something too. Like, what's the deal? This doesn't make sense. Like, the Passover concept, if we're not careful, seems odd. What do you mean? The person that doesn't trust God, this is a senseless activity. This does not make any sense. The Passover meal, this is foolish. Matter of fact, there were people who didn't do it. We're not going to do that. I will eat the lamb, though. It's a great, great supper. But what is putting the blood? They don't do it. Why? Faith that God would show mercy on the bloodshed of this lamb as a sign of the promise. God would show mercy for the families that had the blood on the doorpost, and he would show mercy to them. This was accordingly done. It was done in the scriptures. And this destroyer, the angel, came, passed over the land of Egypt, and everywhere that he saw this blood on the doorpost, he passed right over and went to the next house. It was there, he passed over, and all through the land of Egypt, the firstborn were killed. The Passover lamb's blood symbolized for us Jesus' death as a means of rescue from the enslavement of sin. If you want to dive deeper in that, we've already talked about Hebrews chapter 2, Hebrews chapter 9, the power of the Passover. Look at John chapter 1, 2 Corinthians chapter 5. This Passover lamb, Jesus is the Passover lamb. He is the one whose blood provides us with this protection. Christ is the Lamb. He is the one who's sacrificed for us so that we could experience the mercy and grace of God. Our faith in Jesus, our Passover Lamb, is what saves us. We are saved by grace through faith alone, not of works, lest anyone should boast in their own merit. I don't know where you are, but I want you to understand that because of Adam's sin, we are all dead in our trespasses and sin. And because of Christ's sacrifice on the cross, we have the opportunity to be made right with God. And if we place our faith and trust in Christ, Christ's righteousness is then imputed to us. He gives us that righteousness so that when God looks at us, he doesn't see sin, he sees the righteousness of Christ. We are saved by this Passover lamb who died for the sins of the world. If I were to take the sermon today and just sort of divide it and condense it down into a single sentence, here's the sermon today. Living a life of faith will leave a legacy of faith. If you will live a life of faith today, you will leave a legacy of faith. The legacy of my father is present today in me and my brother, and it is present in my son and my nieces. A life of faith will leave a legacy of faith. Are we willing to live that life? Because it will cost us things of this world. We'll have to prioritize. We'll have to sacrifice. We'll have to live without. We'll have to do things that may be a little different than what the norm is, what the culture says we should do, or what our 401... We have to be willing to live a life of faith regardless of the consequences and outcomes. It leave a legacy. Now, I don't know where you are. I don't know what God is speaking to you about or challenge you to think about, but I believe that whenever God's word is presented, it demands a response. What is God speaking to you about today? I don't know what it is. I have a couple options I'd like to just sort of lay out before you. On the worship guide, there's a section on here called Next Steps. Next Steps is a place for you to kind of let us know what your next step is. Here are three that maybe you would say today that you admit that your sin, you admit you are a sinner, and that you turn to God by faith in the shed blood of Jesus. Maybe today is the day of salvation for you. Maybe you've not made that decision. Maybe you've not placed your faith in Christ and submitted to Him. Today could be the day. Or maybe you would say, I commit to live an example of second wind faith to my children, my grandchildren. I'm going to live that life. I'm going to live it out. They're going to see faith lived out in me. Are you willing to do that? Or maybe you say, I choose to rest my identity in who God has called me to be rather than what fear or culture tells me to be.